Good afternoon, everybody, and morning to folks out in the Western U.S. This is Ken Brown with Transportation Energy Partners. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's presentation. Hopefully you can see the slides and you can hear me. If not, please hit your chat box. Before we get started, I want to remind people, if you have questions, please type your questions in the question box. We have a fair amount to cover today, and a lot of, I guess there's action and inaction here in Washington, as you've been, I'm sure, hearing about on the news. So I'm going to give you an update, and for those of you who will be coming to the Energy Independence Summit next month, we're going to talk about how to prepare yourselves to get the most out of the summit, and especially our day on Capitol Hill. So with that, I'm going to jump in. Before we get started, a special thank you to all of our sponsors who help make the work of Transportation Energy Partners and all of our stakeholders possible, and who help make the Energy Independence Summit possible. So we thank you. And I want to give a special shout out to the South Shore Clean Cities Coalition based in Indiana. And I know they do a lot of work outside of Indiana as well, in the Midwest, in Illinois, for sponsoring today's webinar and making it possible. Just a quick review. I know most of you know this, but Transportation Energy Partners is a nonprofit organization that provides policy support to the nation's clean cities coalitions and our 15,000 stakeholders across the country. We work to keep coalitions and stakeholders informed of key federal policies, programs, and funding opportunities, and we focus on educating decision makers in the federal agencies and the Congress about the importance of advancing markets for cleaner vehicles and fuels. And I think, as everybody knows, we have our big annual event, the Energy Independence Summit, coming up next month. We'll feature roundtables with federal agencies, meetings with congressional leaders, update on the VW settlement, new trends in industry, roundtables with federal agencies, a full day of meetings on Capitol Hill with members of Congress on Tuesday, the February 13th. We'll have our reception hosted by UPS on Tuesday evening, the 13th. It's a great event, and it's an important event this year. As I think most of you know, there's a lot of uncertainty with respect to federal policies and funding and programs and incentives affecting the clean transportation industry. And this is an important time to come to Washington to defend the incentives, to fight for our policies and our funding, and to make sure that we maintain our bipartisan support for funding policies and incentives. So I really, for those of you who haven't registered, there's still time to register. The early bird registration discounts are still available. They're not going to be available much longer. They're going to expire this week by tomorrow night. So be sure to make your registration by Wednesday evening to get the early bird discount. We need you, just want to underscore that we really need you to come to Washington. It's an important year, and we need you to bring those Clean Cities coalitions, to bring your stakeholders as well. I know the folks from Ohio already have at least 10 stakeholders coming from their coalition, and we really need to get a representative from as many coalitions as possible here in DC. So thanks to those of you who are coming, and I encourage those of you who are not registered yet to make your registration, make your hotel arrangements, and come to DC because it's an important year. Why is it an important year? There's a lot of uncertainty out there. I think, as everybody knows, the administration has pulled out of the International Climate Treaty. They've proposed cuts to many clean energy programs. They have not even nominated many of their political appointees at EPA, Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, and other agencies. At the same time, we have strong bipartisan support in Congress, but we need to work hard to maintain that support. I think, as everybody knows, we had a one-day government shutdown because of disagreements over immigration and an inability to finalize the budget negotiations for the current fiscal year. At the same time, we may have infrastructure legislation that could provide opportunities for alternative fuels infrastructure. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but there's a lot going on, and we need you here in DC to help maintain our support. What are our priorities in terms of policies? One, extending the tax incentives that have expired for alternative fuels, vehicles, and infrastructure, increase federal funding for key programs, including the Clean Cities program and the diesel emission reduction grants, preserve the renewable fuel standard, to work with the Federal Highway Administration to approve waivers for the Buy America standards, which are stalling a number of critical funding for critical projects under the CMAQ program, and to work to include alternative fuels in any new infrastructure initiatives. Where are we on tax incentives? Number one, I think, as everybody knows, a number of key tax incentives that we all depend on, the industry depends on, have expired at the end of 2016, and they remain expired and not active. While Congress did pass tax reform legislation, the good news is the final bill maintained the credit for electric vehicles, the $7,500 credit, but it did not include all of those tax incentives that expired. What's the outlook? Senator Hatch from Utah has proposed a broad package of legislative package that includes a number of alternative energy tax extenders, including the ones that affect the transportation industry. Senator Grassley from Iowa is also a big supporter, who's another member of the Senate Finance Committee. We got pretty good bipartisan support in the Senate. However, the House is less supportive. The strategy is to attach the package of extenders to the FY28 Omnibus Appropriations Bill when it moves, which is still a bit questionable, but we need a vehicle to attach the extenders to, and that's the one that everybody's looking at. And in terms of what you all can do in the meantime, and what we'll be working on most likely when you're in DC, is to focus on the House and Senate leadership, which would be folks like in the Senate, Senator Mitch McConnell, and Senator Cornyn on the Republican side, and Senators Schumer and Durbin on the Democratic side. And then in the House, it would be on House Speaker Paul Ryan and Kevin McCarthy and Stephen Scalise from Louisiana on the Republican side, and on the Democratic side, folks like Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and James Clyburn on the House side. So that's where we really need to focus our attention. along with members of the tax committees, which would be the Finance Committee in the Senate and the Ways and Means Committee on the House. And many of you will be meeting with them if you're in DC, and if you're not able to come to DC, you should contact your members on the tax incentives. We have a good chance to pass the extenders, but it is still very much in doubt, and we need all of your support to make it a reality. And here are the key leaders of the tax committees. Another main priority for us is the renewable fuel standard. The good news is EPA actually finalized the RFS for cellulosic biofuel, biomass, diesel and advanced biofuel, and total renewable fuel through 2018, and for biomass-based diesel through 2019. At the same time, the petroleum industry is still working to undermine the program, both through the administration and Congress. So we need to remain strong. Here you can see the numbers. I'm not going to go over all these, but the recording and the slides will be on Transportation Energy Partners website, so you can take a look at these. And our message is that the renewable fuel standard is working, providing energy security, economic security, and environmental security. And we need to work when we're in town for the summit to encourage both lawmakers and the administration to continue to support a strong renewable fuel standard. Now to funding. As everybody knows, our key priorities are to maintain the increased funding for the Clean Cities program, including funding for competitive grants, and to maintain the increased funding we won for FY 2017 for the EPA Clean Diesel grants. So where are we in the appropriations process? We're going to be dealing, as we were last year, with 2 fiscal years at the same time. First, the fiscal year 2018 appropriations have not been completed, as those of you know, as most of you know. We are in the middle of fiscal year 2018, which started on October 1st. And the full House and Senate, the full House and the Senate Appropriations Committee have passed all of the bills, and they've started to negotiate the final bills. As you know, the government was shut down on Monday. It reopened today. And as part of that agreement, the government will continue to be funded at last year's level for a period of, for another, basically, I think it's 3 weeks through February 8th. And at that time, during that time, they are going to attempt to at least come to an agreement over the overall budget numbers. So where we're at is they can't agree on how much to spend for each agency and each federal program until they come to an overall agreement on the budget numbers for what they're going to spend on the military and discretionary domestic programs. And they have not reached those agreements yet. Apparently, they're very close to reaching an agreement, but the final agreement on those numbers were stalled by their inability to reach an agreement on immigration, which led to the government shutdown. So we do not yet have final overall budget numbers, and as a result, we don't have any agreement on what's the funding levels for things like the Clean Cities program and the diesel emission reduction grants and all kinds of other federal programs that we care about. So that's where we're at. The hope is that by February 8th, they will at least have an agreement on the overall numbers, and then it will take them a couple more weeks to agree on the funding levels for the specific programs. So that's the hope. I guess there's an outside chance they could do everything by February 8th, but I think that's a long shot. In terms of where we're at, so you can see this in fiscal year 2017, this is for the Clean Cities program. There's $34 million for the Clean Cities program and $15 million for grants. And it included language that grants should be in the 500,000 to $1 million range, which is something that we have supported. Our recommendations for fiscal year 2018 are $40 million for the program, including $20 million for grants and the same language. The president's budget for the current fiscal year included $0 for Clean Cities. The House bill included $0 for the program, but they did include some language, both supporting the program and our grants language. And then the Senate included $28 million, but they put too much in for grants. And they also recommended that the grants favor states with higher greenhouse gas emissions from, excuse me one second. Sorry about that, including states with higher levels of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're trying to fix that language to have a more balanced amount for dollars supporting the program, as well as and grants, as well as to get rid of this language that would favor states with higher greenhouse gas emissions, because we think all states should have an equal ability to apply for competitive grants. Anyway, the numbers here look pretty good, but we don't know where we're gonna end up for the current fiscal year until they do the overall numbers. If for some reason, on the outside chance that they aren't able to reach an agreement, which I think is unlikely, but possible, then the program will be funded at last year's levels, which would be acceptable. But the problem is, without an agreement, it's difficult for the department to move forward with the funding, even at last year's levels. In terms of the clean diesel grants, you can see here last year's funding was at $60 million. The president's budget included $10 million. The House included $75 million, and the Senate included $40 million. So we're in good shape, assuming they can actually reach an agreement, and hopefully we'll end up somewhere between 40 and 75 million, and at least at the 60 million that the program received last year. Then we also have upcoming the fiscal year 2019 appropriations process. What's supposed to happen is the president is supposed to typically would propose his budget in February. Now that may not happen, because it may happen, but it may not happen because they still haven't completed the FY18 appropriations process. So it's possible that the budget may not come out until later February or early March. The one step is not in here. The appropriations subcommittees will be taking appropriations requests from members of Congress, the House and the Senate, and that will typically they'll typically have deadlines in March. for those requests, and that's an important part of our process, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. The subcommittees will consider their legislation in May and June, and then the House and Senate floor action hopefully will take place in the summer, and the final legislation ideally would be done by September 30th, though that has not happened in a long time, as we're witnessing this year. So we're going to be working over the next several months, both on finishing up the 2018 legislation as well as the 2019 appropriations process. Here are the key leaders of the appropriations process in the House and the Senate. There are two committees that the Energy and Water Appropriations Subcommittee funds the Department of Energy, including the Clean Cities Program, and the Interior Appropriations Committee funds the Environmental Protection Agency, which includes the clean diesel grants. So what is our appropriation strategy? So when you are in Washington, or if you're not coming to Washington, you need to find out your member of the House and the Senate, their process for appropriations requests and their deadlines. So essentially, every member of Congress, the House and the Senate, has the opportunity to submit requests to the Appropriations Subcommittee, and those requests would be funding levels for various programs that they care about. And each member submits a letter to the specific Appropriations Subcommittee. And most members of Congress have a process where they will take requests from constituents. Some of them have a request form, and others accept a letter. And most of them have a deadline for those requests. And those deadlines are typically anywhere from kind of the middle or end of February to early March. And so your job is to find out what your members' request deadlines are, and to find out what their process is. Do they have a form? If so, how do you get that form? Or will they just take a letter with your request? And then we will help you fill out those forms and give you a sample letter that you can send in, which will include our specific appropriations request language. And then your goal is to demonstrate, that your coalition supports it and you have broad-based support from your stakeholders by either including them in the form or including them in your letter. And then you need to follow up with your congressional offices after you submit the request to make sure that they then submit your request to the subcommittees. And that is a critical part of the process, and that has been a key part of our success, has been to get members to do that. So please help do that. So I have a couple of questions real quick before we move on to the next section. For those of us attending the summit, do we reach out to set up meetings, or will we do it? We can help you set up those meetings, and you should contact my colleague Jacob Schwemline. Actually, why don't you can just send me an email or call me, and I will connect you with Jacob, who will do the emails. My email is ken@akbstrategies.com. It'll be a slide with it on, and I'll give you my phone number, which is 202-674-7777. We could advise you on setting up your own meetings, or we're happy to set them up for you. Second is, what's our plan if the government shuts down on February 9th? We will have to roll with the punches a little bit. I do not think the government will shut down on February 9th, though it's possible. and if it does, we will move forward. Most of the congressional offices, or many of them, will remain open, so hopefully we can still do our meetings, or at least a number of our meetings, and we will move forward with the summit as planned. But actually, I think it's unlikely. I think all sides are realizing that nobody looks good when there's a shutdown, and so I think they will do everything to avoid it. But there's no guarantee. So with that, let's move on. Two other issues that we're going to be working on. One is, I know that some of you are being impacted by this, but a couple of years ago, our organization worked with a number of cities and coalitions and industry allies to work with the Federal Highway Administration to develop a process that was more streamlined for them to approve waivers to the Buy America provisions that were preventing the spending of CMAQ dollars on alternative fuel vehicles. And I know since the Trump administration has come in, they issued some new guidance, and as a result, that waiver process is stalled. So we are again working with a number of coalitions and others to help break that logjam, and we may include that as part of our meetings. We'll likely do that this year, and we're working to set up a meeting with the key people at the Federal Highway Administration as well. And secondly, there may be infrastructure legislation. The administration has come out just this week with, I don't know if it's public, but drafts are floating around of the outline of their proposal. As of now, it includes transportation, it includes some stuff related to the upgrading the power grid infrastructure. Currently, it does not include anything specifically on alternative fuels infrastructure like fueling stations and fueling infrastructure. However, there are a number of us working to get that added in. So that's another item that's out there. And broadly, what do we need to do? We need to keep working with the administration, working with members of Congress, rallying our stakeholders, and again, please attend the summit. So with that, I want to talk briefly just to remind folks about how to prepare for Capitol Hill Day and the importance of meeting with your members of Congress. Again, to emphasize that it's not just important for what we're working on now, but it's important for the work that you do over time. And it helps your organization, it helps advance our policies, and it helps you build long-term relationships with your key policymakers who represent you. Again, it's all about relationships, and being in Washington and doing these meetings are an opportunity to build and strengthen your relationships, build them with new offices, and strengthen your relationships with others. I know that people who come to the summit every year can tell you that every year they go back, their relationships get better, they have contact between the visits, and it helps our cause every year. Remember that all politics is local, and that when you're in meetings or outside of meetings, you want to focus on educating decision makers about the value and benefits of clean transportation policies and incentives and funding for your specific area. It's helpful to provide facts and figures on how cleaner fuels and vehicles and infrastructure are creating jobs and benefiting your area. It's very beneficial and extremely helpful to provide specific examples of local projects and programs in action. For example, highlighting new infrastructure, new stations, whether it's electric, natural gas, propane, that are being installed or have been installed using as a result of tax incentives or federal funding. Also highlight examples of fleets that are converting to whether it's propane, natural gas, electric, biofuels, hybrids, or whatever. Again, specific examples are the best ways to communicate, and it's important to show the breadth of your local coalition, whether that's fuel providers, vehicle makers, infrastructure companies, fleet managers, local elected officials, state elected officials. All those people can help demonstrate the broad-based and bipartisan support that we have across the country. It's important after your meetings in Washington to follow up and follow through. If you don't know the answer to a question they have, find the answer and get back to them. It's important to send thank you notes. It's very valuable to stay in touch throughout the year by sending reports, newsletters, and any regular updates to congressional staff, both staff in Washington and also staff that's back in the district, your state. It's very valuable to invite elected officials to local events, whether they're workshops, media events, ride and drives, whatever you're doing. And it's even valuable if they don't come. It's just valuable to invite them to the opportunity. If they do come, it's a great way to strengthen your relationship. And you should always be looking for opportunities for media coverage where elected officials can help support what you're doing. In terms of some specific media preparation, you should prepare a one-pager or a front and back at the most, with a little background on your organization and examples, a couple of examples of local projects in action. We will send around a couple of samples of good ones that people have developed. I know the folks in Alabama have a good one. Lori in Wisconsin has done a great one. Tony in Philadelphia has done one. A lot of folks have done good short handouts that highlight your organization and projects. It's good if they have visuals, like some photos or graphs on them. Be sure to bring your business cards, pen and paper. Keep your phones on vibrate or silent. And then also, it's very important for those of you in DC, to wear comfortable shoes. You will be doing a lot of walking on Capitol Hill Day, and you should wear shoes that are good for walking. Wear your boots that are made for walking. Some meeting tips. Be brief and to the point. You should expect the meeting to last at least 15 minutes, and in no way will it be any more than 30 minutes. You should keep your presentation short and leave lots of times for questions. Focus your specific requests for action. They want to know how they can help. Be factual. Know the opposition. There are pros and cons to every debate, and be respectful. Even if the member of Congress or staffer disagree with you, you should respect their views. Even if they're not going to support us on this one, there will be future opportunities to work together. Again, remember the long-term relation building. In terms of a sample meeting agenda, and we'll provide this to you all, the best way to run these meetings is to have a team leader who will introduce your team and the overall message, then have somebody who would provide a couple of brief examples of local projects in action, and then focus on our specific requests for action, such as extending the tax incentives, increasing funding, and preserving the renewable fuel standard. And again, we'll have materials for you, handouts that you can leave behind, as well as some things that you can look at in the week before you come to DC so that you're prepared. Somebody asked earlier about assistance. We will organize by state. So, for example, like Ohio will probably have 2 teams covering the state, led by 2 different members of Clean Fuels Ohio and their stakeholders. And then we'll have a team, usually 1 team for most states, and then for big states like California, Pennsylvania, maybe New York, we'll have 2 teams covering, you know, east and west, or northern and southern parts of the state. As I mentioned before, we can provide help in scheduling meetings. We will give you a sample appropriations request letter. We'll give you talking points and handouts for the meetings, and we will also provide a sample local press release that you can send before you come to DC. Again, thank you to our sponsors. And does anybody have, please, I do not see any more questions. Anybody else have questions? Questions before we leave? Again, I want to answer the questions, the 2 questions that I got before. Well, I'll answer the new question. Should we invite congressional staff to the UPS reception? Yes. You are more than welcome to invite, when you're doing your congressional staff meetings, or even in advance, to the reception that UPS hosts for us. And there's not really, we don't really have a formal invite to the reception, but you can just send them an email. Maybe if we have time, we'll figure out how to draft up a formal email that you could send to invite your congressional staff ahead of time. Somebody asked about my contact information. Here is my contact information. I'll leave that up on the screen. Again, somebody asked, will we help schedule your Capitol Hill Day meetings? The answer is yes. But you need to send me an email or call me, and then I will put you in touch with my colleague, Jake, who's organizing the meetings. Some people do their own meetings. I would say we organize the meetings for well over half of the coalitions attending. And we also were asked about, again, what happens if the government shuts down on February 9th. The Energy Independence Summit is happening whether the government's open or not. I think it's highly unlikely it will be shut down. I think all parties have realized that nobody wins if there's a shutdown, but in the current climate, there's no guarantee. But if there is a shutdown, many congressional offices will remain open. We may be constrained in meeting with some of the federal agency people if there's a shutdown, but we will go ahead with most of our meetings on Capitol Hill. They'll be open because they're will be negotiating whatever their deal is if there's a shutdown. But the bottom line is I don't think there's going to be a shutdown, and we will keep you posted, obviously. And then there's a question about Buy America. As I mentioned, some of us will be meeting with the Federal Highway Administration on the Buy America issues on February 16th, Friday, and we're working on communications with them in advance of the meeting, and we may have an opportunity to discuss in our roundtable with the Department of Transportation on February 14th. We'll be looking to discuss some of those issues as well. But it looks like some of us will be meeting with the acting administrator of the FHWA on February 16th. And we may have some talking points for you to discuss with your members of Congress on Capitol Hill Day on February 13th about the Buy America provisions. Last chance for questions. Last chance. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your participation. Again, please register for the summit if you haven't already. It's a very important year. We need you in DC, and we will be in touch. If you have any questions, please send me an email or give me a call. Thanks, everybody. Take care and have a great rest of your week.